Okay, good. So let's kick it off then. I would suggest first let's have something kind of a legal disclaimer ahead. So just be wary that anything that we share, there's a lot of things still in the move. So please always consider also involving your legal advisor, tax advisors into anything that you do in with regards to CBAM. So what we share today are things that we see. But please also apply your own scrutiny when elaborating these strategies. So what is planned for today? So we have 1 hour planned. First, I just want to make sure that we all start kind of from the same point. So just understanding the basics and how the EU ETS and CBAM add a cost element to carbon. Then second will be what are the financial implications. We'll break down the CBAM cost equation, understand what are actually variables that are still unclear, where you can manage or with efforts try to improve certain elements, and then go into how to navigate these financials. So what are really the cost drivers and potential mitigation strategies that you can apply, and why it's actually relevant to start doing so now. Then just to round up, there's some news around CBAM, so we'll briefly cover those to then also wrap up and share our view what priorities should be in the second half of this year, so that in the end you are well equipped to follow your CBAM strategy, or actually start defining one if you don't have one in place right now. So first, really starting with the basics, and I think all of you have been probably in contact or exposed to the EU ETS, and if not, at least for CBAM. So just briefly, the EU ETS puts a price on emissions. So right now, the cost per CO2, per ton of CO2 equivalent is around 70, 80 euros. And the EU ETS is designed in a way that over the next years, the supply of these EU emission allowances will phase out, making the supply so reducing the supply and thereby increasing the price. So we expect that there will be a quite significant price increase over the next years. So that applies to EU installations. So therefore, the EU CBAM targets carbon leakage. So that is defined as a setup or situation where production is transferred to non-EU countries to avoid this carbon taxation. And that's exactly the reasoning of the EU, that carbon-heavy products are then affected by the CBAM to create a level playing field. And that applies to all non-EU countries. There's certain exceptions. So right now for Norway, Liechtenstein, and Switzerland, but then also on the horizon. So as briefly mentioned before, there's something on the horizon that the UK CBAM will also be linked and therefore be excluded from the scope of the EU CBAM. But that is something that still needs to be defined and is probably not aligned until January 1st, 2026. So the first reporting period will still be including the UK flows for any company. So I think it's something that is actually quite well established right now. At least you see them there. You probably are aware of these elements. So what does that mean? And maybe also then looking into the future, what will change as a result of the definitive period but also as a result of the currently still in negotiations or still in legislation, in the legislative process, being discussions of CBAM. So first, businesses need to assess or collect. So there's something in there quite important for your CBAM strategy. Then starting 2026, you need to verify emissions, to then report on those verified emissions, and in the end, procure CBAM certificates. So right now, and that is the process that most of you are currently undergoing, is that you are either collecting in a quite painful process, collecting primary emissions from your suppliers. So I hope that they are actually able to do so, because that is something that we quite frequently hear, that they are not capable or don't have the data off the shelf. Or and also that is something that we quite frequently hear, you simply assess what is the scope of our CBAM situation, and we purely rely, or you would purely rely on default values. So in this first step, there was one important element that needs to be considered in your CBAM strategy, and that is that the omnibus would allow you to report on 100% default values. Important to note there is that the EU has not released these default values, and also not the CBAM benchmark. So about these two elements, we'll dive deeper into that later in this presentation, but it is expected that they will disclose these data points in Q3 2025. So in terms of verifying these results, also there EU is still pending the rules of the verification. So in the end, there is one role defined as the verifier, third-party verifier, so that any result needs to be some kind of audited. The reporting, I think that is something quite deterministic, where results are consolidated. And the change that we will see there is that you go from a quarterly reporting, which is the case right now, to a annual reporting. That being said, obviously, it does not make sense to only look into CBAM once per year then. It's just that the interaction with the EU or the registry will decrease from 4 times per year to 1 time per year for this consolidated report. And lastly, procurement of the CBAM certificates. So in the first year, there will be different holding requirements than in the steady state. So I think to simplify, their businesses will need to procure the respective CBAM certificates, and make sure that they hold enough in the time when the import is happening, and then when the actual report is submitted, creating a certain time gap between procurement and surrender of these CBAM certificates. The price of those will be linked to the EU emission trading system, so the EU ETS, and therefore can also be, so as I said earlier, can also be expected to increase over time. So going then after those basics, what will change into the financial implications? So really the core element that we believe businesses right now need to have on their horizon, or need to start engaging with, and to start understanding really what the cost equation is of CBAM for their business specifically. So why should you care? I think there it's really important to understand that depending on obviously the inbound prices, the embedded emissions, cost increases can be quite significantly. And if not managed now, there's a certain risk that this just leads to P&L impact that is not really managed and in 1 year cannot be mitigated anymore. And we ran for one illustrative product. We, following certain estimates, obviously, we did a small case calculation where we saw that in the first year alone, without any market price fluctuations, without any supplier price increases for this product, we saw a 5% cost increase in the first year, and then over the years increasing to a 20% cost increase. And I think that number just shows what is the importance and why to really have that on top of mind when thinking about these commodity codes, because otherwise there will be a bit of a surprise when going through P&L items in more detail. And the other element is actually something that also needs to be considered. So right now we're still in the transitional phase. So all that needs to be reported are the embedded emissions. However, if you think about processes that start or are about to start now in H2, it's budget setting pricing for 2026. And you will also start to initiate business and POs that will be affected by CBAM costs already. So if then the import happens 2026, obviously these flows or import flows will be subject to the CBAM costs. So, and if you then miss that this is something that needs to be considered, there's a certain risk that there also will be certain surprises then down the line, because think about an import in January 2026. Business was probably initiated quite some time earlier, so maybe in September, October 2025, and up to the point where the certificate is purchased and surrendered, there's quite some time gap, and really hard to then keep track of the different elements driving the costs of the product. Obviously, there is in some cases it's not steel or aluminum are not necessarily 100% of the BOM costs or the material costs you have in your business, but that's exactly also the issue or the challenge with CBAM, that it will be hidden in a very low level of the P&L in the end, making it hard to trace it back to where the cost was actually incurred or created. So hope that kind of this relevance and also the certain urgency to act is clear. So the key question is then how much is CBAM going to cost, and what are the elements driving this cost equation? And now don't be reminded of school, but I think it's really core in this case to just put down this equation, break it up, and go down to the elements that you can influence, where maybe there's some certain uncertainty in the equation or ambiguity, and you need to come up with certain estimates, but there's also certain factors in there. So I think that would be the idea, to now go down or go through this cost equation and understand what can be influenced and should be addressed in your CBAM strategy. So the first element is something that probably you are quite familiar with now, because that was also what you collected or added to the reports that you submitted over the last quarters during the transitional period, which is the embedded emissions. So the tons of CO2 equivalents per CN code, per product, whatever granularity you used in the report or the AGC, as shared by your suppliers if available, or if not, use of the default values. Right now, during the transitional period, depending on the national legislation, there was a certain cap on the use of default values. But as said earlier, actually for the CBAM cost equation, 100% of the embedded emissions could be assessed or estimated using default values. Second element is then the CBAM benchmark, which is per CN code as defined by the EU. That element, so tons of CO2 equivalents, is also something that still needs to be defined by the EU. So as said earlier, Q3 is what we is when we expect an information or update there. Then the third element is the phase-in factor. So that's per year, also as defined by the EU. In that case, we have certainty already. So we know that in the first year, the CBAM bench, or in the first year of the definitive period, the CBAM phase-in factor will be 97.5%. So reducing the CBAM benchmark by 2.5%. And the last element is the EU allowance price. So that's the market price that you will pay. So I think just on that level, I hope that is somewhat clear. We do see most of the uncertainty, of course, in this element of the CBAM benchmark. So that obviously drives to some degree, or drives to a large degree, the cost equation. And then the second element is the phase-in factor, where there's actually not that much uncertainty. However, we see misunderstanding. And in quite some conversations with prospects and our customers, we've actually discussed that no, you won't pay 2.5% of your embedded emissions. So the embedded emissions times the phase-in factor, the 2.5%. No, the CBAM benchmark will be adjusted by the 1 minus phase-in factor, so the 2.5%, then coming to the 97.5. And that is something that, if that is the starting point or the basis of any business case calculation or assessment, is then really exposing you to a certain risk when the phase-in factor is not correctly used. And when we bring this up in conversations, in quite sometimes eye-opening, that the expected cost is much higher than initially anticipated. So let's go then into the individual cost element, explore them a bit deeper. So the embedded emissions, that as said, is the value that you would collect from suppliers or use the EU default values. Important here is that it's either direct and or the indirect emissions that are in scope, and that is dependent on the CN code. And there will be a significant change in the use of default values. So while we do not know how the EU will set these values exactly, or have, no, we do not know the values exactly, but we do know a certain element of the methodology that they will apply. Because right now the CBAM factors are set up in a way that they are based on the 10% of the worst performing EU installations. However, it is expected that this will change to the 10% of the most carbon-intensive third country producers. So if you right now base your business case or your CBAM cost calculation on the default values as you are using them right now in the transitional period, also there is a risk that you underestimate your total CBAM cost exposure. On top, there's also currently no punitive markup added to the default value, which will be the case in the in the definitive period. So therefore, using the transitional default values for the CBAM cost is a very optimistic view of assessing your cost exposure. You can plug in certain estimates, certain assumptions, obviously, to then understand what is the potential cost, CBAM costs. However, just using the current default values is not what we suggest. And those embedded emissions, so if you don't use the default values, are then subject to the verification, where we also see in the market right now a certain uncertainty. So that some market participants actually claim that you cannot collect data about the calendar year 2025 on these embedded emissions from your suppliers, but you must wait until 2026 is closed and only in 2027, looking back at 2026, start collecting these embedded emissions. But we don't see that in the legislation itself. There is some room for interpretation. However, we believe that collecting 2025 data is already would already comply with the legislation and put you in a good spot for CBAM, so to understand your CBAM cost exposure and also to report based on these 2025 values. So going into the next element, the CBAM benchmarks. Sorry to repeat, but there is unfortunately quite some elements that are still pending. So as said earlier, this is something that still needs to be set by the EU. So there are also certain elements that we can leverage from the EU ETS benchmarks, but those are following a different logic. So they can be used as references, but not for all CN codes because they follow just a different process in that framework. Those benchmarks will be set on a CN code level or on an AGC level. So that is dependent on the product itself, but we will see more when those benchmark values are then disclosed by the EU. So, and phase-in factor, so I briefly mentioned it earlier, and actually while preparing this, obviously today we are all using a lot of artificial intelligence, and I just was curious what AI would respond to my question on the phase-in, and that was actually not surprising at all, but just shows that better check the sources of AI, or in not only AI, but in any case, because AI here suggested me that only 2.5% of the full CBAM costs will be subject to be actually paid. Then when clicking on this on the link sign when using this, in this case, the AI, there, when checking the source, it was again correct, where the default value, now the benchmark value was adjusted with the respective phase-in factor. So here that's kind of the same formula I'm using above. So in this case, the factor was applied correctly as it's suggested in the legislation. However, AI suggested only this very small number of expected costs next year. So what is it, and how does it kind of also align with the EU ETS free allocation phase out? So the phase-in factor kind of or basically mirrors the phase out. So while the EU ETS is phased out, the CBAM is phased in. So first year the benchmark will be adjusted by 2.5%, and then following a certain pattern until it reaches 0% in 2034. That's when CBAM will be fully phased in and the EU ETS will be fully phased out. So as suggested, the EU CBAM is creating this level playing field between EU and non-EU installations, and that's why these two go hand in hand, basically. Then the last element of the cost equation is the EUA price. So the CBAM certificates, they will be a derivative of the EU ETS permits, and they will be priced on a quarterly basis based on the average EUA price. So generally, the consensus is that these prices will increase. So also there, looking around in the market, what are the expectations? And there's one firm out there that frequently discloses a forecast and consolidates different views in the industry, and that's what they call the RELEPA, and there we see right now we are a bit below 100 euro, expected to rise until 2034 to roughly 200. I think that's a forecast. There's certain uncertainty again in that figure, but for input into a business case and understanding, okay, what's the effect of the EUA price and how we manage CBAM generally, this belief it will increase, and it will increase to a number somewhere between 150 and 200 over the next years, is already a very solid input factor that you could base the assumption on. However, while there's this consensus, this price is also subject to certain fluctuations. So, and that is something that we also see in the market, that there's financial products that start to be created to bridge this gap that we saw earlier between the PO and then the customs clearance and the certificate purchase. Because ideally, at the time of PO what the expected CBAM costs are, because you have all factors in place, of all elements of the CBAM equation in place, to have a kind of bulletproof calculation and profitability expectation on that order. However, there's obviously some prices attached to this security, and only makes sense if import volumes are really high enough, and you're really subject to those fluctuations. Then the last element, and I did not just for simplicity add that to the equation itself, but there will be the adjustment of carbon prices paid at origin. So we see more and more countries starting carbon schemes, such as Turkey or other countries, and those costs the producer pay at origin can be reduced or will be reducing your CBAM cost exposure. So far, there was tremendous effort required and a lot of analytical work to be done to really match your imports with the respective carbon prices paid at origin. And that's something that where the EU also simplifies processes, and same as with the emissions, they will also allow the use of default values for carbon prices paid overseas on a country level. Okay, so taking a quick breath and sip of water after this very theoretical and very mathematical explanation. However, I think this is really key that this is understood, and now that we then go the next step and what are really the influenceable elements that you can in the day-to-day operations or by in a smart way including them in business as usual processes manage the cost equation. So because ideally the CBAM costs are reduced to the minimum, and we can do that addressing three key variables probably. So embedded emissions, if we break that down into to the two underlying variables, that's number 1 and 2, and then the EUA price. So the import volume, basically the tons of products that you import, and then the second is the carbon intensity that we will now go into. So import volume. So I think the simplest strategy to reduce CBAM cost is if you understand your total CBAM volumes, you can manage them, right? So it's you can decrease the overall import volume to a degree where you're not affected by CBAM at all. So we have this 50 tons per year CBAM threshold, or you can set up your supply chain in a different way so that also there your import volumes of CBAM affected products become less, and you set up the supply chain in a different way. So that is keeping the same supplier or not keeping the same supplier. So thinking of nearshoring versus having flows done via dealers, where they are then the importer of the CBAM products. Just erasing my notes here that I made on the fly. So second element is the carbon intensity. So obviously there is then this tons of CO2 equivalents that should be reduced. And the starting point is to actually collect primary data, right? So we said earlier, use of default values is anticipated to be highly punitive by the EU. So they want businesses to collect primary data. So relying on those default values will put you in a very high cost position. So once that baseline is then established, you can also prioritize your engagement. So does it make sense with 150 suppliers to collect carbon data for each and every one of them? If there's a certain Pareto also in these suppliers, probably not. And it makes sense to identify who are the suppliers that are knowledgeable or capable of providing such data, that make up most of my of the carbon intensity in the products. And at the same time, we do not have to invest heavily in creating knowledge with them, but also to verify the data with them. So this prioritization logic is also something that where the EU actually allows now a bit more, because they say 100% could be default values, but if you use it for 20% of your supply account, it's fine. And maybe these 20% of supply account make up only 5% of your carbon emissions. So ideally, you need to understand who are those suppliers and where to invest heavily in collecting this. And the third mitigation here is to really then embed CBAM into the commercial processes. So, and not necessarily only CBAM, but the element of carbon. So understanding the carbon baseline with the supplier, including targets and also certain data sharing elements, so that they simply need to comply with CBAM. So that a request cannot be ignored, but you have a commercial lever with them, so that that you get the data you need to comply, and you get the data that you need to manage your cost exposure. So that is something also we need to start doing right now, because that's when the onboarding happens to the volumes that will be imported next year. That's where commercial negotiations happen. So if these elements are started then only next year, that is then probably affecting 2027. So also good to do it next year, but ideally starting it right now to have the benefit from the very beginning. And then the third element, and that is just as an on an FYI basis, where typically this affects really the heavy importers, so those companies that do one or two, but they also need really to secure the prices. So dealers that frequently trade CBAM products that are exposed to these fluctuations, and they leverage financial products that are coming out now to lock in the EUA prices at the time of the PO. So to not be exposed to those fluctuations and move from those single digits or basis point profitability to non-profitability because of CBAM fluctuations, but they need to lock in the EUA price at the time of the PO. So I think those are the three elements. And what we then, when talking to our customers, typically hear, and there is, of course, a certain repetition in when it comes to projects and how they're set up. But just to re-emphasize this here, that these strategies can only be successful if there are certain patterns. So, and with CBAM being a quite new topic that is organizationally also differently handled, it only makes sense to re-emphasize these elements now that we've discussed what potential mitigation strategies are. So first is that clear ownership. So we see that CBAM is handled sometimes closer to customs, sometimes closer to procurement or sustainability, but wherever it sits, it needs to have a clear owner that also acts with a certain mandate towards management, but also then towards buyers, to exactly enforce the inclusion of CBAM into commercial agreements. So second element is this cross-functional element. So we see that there is logistics involved, customs involved, procurement involved, data is scattered across the organization. And that's why it's really essential that teams then come together and understand the cost impact to then act also with a certain urgency. Third element, also typically needless to say, but just want to re-emphasize it, that this top management support is typically really helpful. So if there's not this sense of urgency and understanding of the business case of CBAM and the potential cost exposure and cost risk, it's also blocking use of tools or inclusion into commercial negotiations in the implementation. The fourth element is really something that I also would like to stress really, is that in light of all the uncertainty that we see with CBAM, it's still essential that there is a business case. And if there's elements that are not known or cannot be pinned down to the last percent of certainty, it's better to act with a 50% number and have a rough business case that is hypothesis driven instead of not having one at all. So in a way, being prepared also for the EU to come back with more definitive answers on different cost elements, to then be able to refine this business case and say, okay, no, we had an assumption there on default values. Now the reality is this and that. Therefore, the impact will be much higher, much lower. But to have an understanding of how the certain variables work and come together, really important to focus on the impact and create this important this business case. And the last element is really think of it more as a joint financial exposure together with suppliers, because in the end, they also need to understand that it puts, in the end, their business into a certain risk, because it creates this level playing field and increases the total landing cost of products. And thereby, they also need to manage this together with the customers. So start working on their emissions and turning around, as intended by the EU, their operations to become less carbon intensive. So that was the overview of the mitigation strategies. So what were the variables that we can actually influence in day-to-day operations, and now the fourth, and then wrapping up with the last element of today's session, with some news, not regarding the CBAM cost, but just what is there on the horizon, and in the news currently for CBAM. So in there, I picked two elements. So one was the EU and the UK CBAM will be linked. To make it very short and having this business lens in mind, is the implication is that in the end, when EU and the UK CBAM are linked, the flows between the EU and UK would be exempted from CBAM. However, that will not be the case in the first year, probably, and the UK CBAM will also only be enacted in 2027. So there will be a certain period where UK flows will still be part of CBAM, but then falling out of the scope. That is currently still in negotiations, and while this is important, it is, as said, you will need to start collecting data from UK suppliers in the first year. And the second one is actually something that also will affect most of your businesses, is that the CBAM scope is expected to increase, but also there's always fast news. Media writes quickly about it. There will be a legislative proposal towards end of this year, and the plan is to both horizontally and also vertically expand CBAM. However, first, and that was also confirmed by the EU, they will focus on the default values, on the emission benchmarks, and on certain levers for exporters to remove some of their pains in this whole whole process. So what do we mean with horizontally? So it would be new sectors. So for example, paper or chemicals. Those elements having certain challenges then in the implementation, but also moving to more downstream goods. So, for example, instead of aluminum and iron and aluminum and steel parts, also for including CN codes for automotive parts or cookware. I think there's the commitment from the EU that they are seeking this balance between capturing emissions and blocking carbon leakage, versus adding even more administrative burden to companies and adding a lot of suppliers to your lists to reach out to and collect CBAM data. So to wrap up, and I think we are good in time. To wrap up, and spend some time on what does this mean now, concretely. What should you focus on in H2, from the CBAM perspective? Obviously, you always have a lot on your plates, and CBAM typically is not the sole focus of the people that we talk to. But we have defined four areas of actions. So one area is to really create the transparency, if not done so, or if you're not doing so already, and share this transparency in the organization. So what does that mean? Is that you collect the emissions from your suppliers, but that also you start putting a euro value next to it. So not only collecting data, but also answering the question: is obtaining this data actually something that is commercially viable for our import volume? So is the effort right, or can we then, coming to this business case element, can we just report possibly on default values, and to include these CBAM costs in the 2026 budgeting rounds, or feed into these processes, to avoid exactly that you are losing out on certain profitability elements in the next year. So the second is that you start then, based on this transparency, crafting your CBAM strategy. So involving buyers, but also other parts of the organization, to create awareness with them, to make them understand what are the variables that drive CBAM costs and how does that factor into their prioritization or into their agenda. So to add that as certain negotiation elements in the upcoming commercial discussions. And then we see this argument that there is that you can actually invest into this precise carbon accounting. So to build the CBAM strategy, but also build the case of, okay, why does it really matter, or why does it make sense for us to really have a precise carbon accounting with our suppliers in place to exactly avoid these higher default values. Then the third, and that is something as a proud European citizen, is something that we should do, to not only complain about CBAM and the pain it brings, but also shape the process. So currently there is the extension of the CBAM, or there's this collection of feedback ongoing. So, and to have a say from the industry and from both a software provider view, but also from the businesses obviously view, it's great to share this and to have a say how CBAM should develop over time. And if not, fourth area of action, you have done so already, become an authorized CBAM declarant. So that is something, so there, act with urgency, where you will need this this authorization to be able to import CBAM goods into the EU as of 2026. So that will be a requirement, and there is a time frame of, I believe it's 1 or 20 days for the application to be reviewed, and the deadline therefore is roughly beginning of September, so that if you want to play it really edgy and risky, you apply after that date. But to be on the safe side, this should be started and submitted before that. And typically, now thinking of August and holiday season, not only one part of the organization is involved in such a process, but there's multiple parts, and managing the stakeholders, aligning them, and educating them about why is this now necessary and what is CBAM, typically takes some time, and therefore that's should be a focus now for the next few weeks if you've not done so right now. So that is the deadline. That's a link to the EU economy and finance page or the EU page where you can share your feedback. And just to wrap up, and then how can we help you there? So I think one is really trying to double down on or making you aware that how does this function. We see it across different customers, we see it across industries, and how different organizations act on it. And with our strong customer footprint in automotive and manufacturing specifically, we actually see what's working, how can we enable suppliers to provide feedback and calculate these emissions, and also go beyond CBAM. So typically, we are in contact not only regarding CBAM with suppliers, but across multiple topics. So be it for other of our modules in the German Supply Chain Act or in EODR, but we are this one common platform for compliance, driving up the supplier engagement. So we have quite a track record in understanding those complex supply chains. Also for CBAM, it's quite essential to have this tier N visibility too. So in some cases, your supplier, that is the exporter, does not have the actual embedded emissions, but this request needs to go down to the tier N level of the supply chain, where we have the ability. And across topics, it's actually something that we can really say is that the supplier engagement is what we think about holistically. So be it EODR, be it CBAM, that we are this one common and known interface to suppliers, and therefore also drive supplier engagement. So instead of sending across emails from unknown platforms or sending around the EU communication template, having Prewave there as established platform to collect data is something that we've seen supplier engagement rates of 80% and higher, really laying the foundation to act on those values, and also will implement the verification once the rules are really defined there, so that you have what you need and can focus on the cost element instead of having to focus a lot of your time and attention on supplier engagement or verification of data. So thank you so much for your attendance today. So we will share the presentation with you along with the recording. So in case your colleagues were not able to make it today, or also this material, you want to leverage it in any management session, or to just educate your organization about the topic, feel free to leverage it. Or in case you want to have a discussion about it, obviously we support you in this context. So feel free to book a call via our website, so prewave.com, for the solutions in the carbon space. We are very happy to hear your pain points and discuss how we can support you in this process to avoid unnecessary surprises when it comes to cost exposure or cost elements in 2027. And with that being said, I wish you a good rest of your day and thank you for your participation today. And we are all excited once the EU comes back and can plug in our or the new numbers into the business cases that we've developed.